I wanted to reread a verse from the song that we just sang a moment ago. So if you have your songbook out there, you can turn to number 94 if you want to follow along. I'm just going to read from the third verse there in just a second. I want to talk about Israel and its current conflict. And essentially, we're going to be exploring what is the Christian supposed to think of the conflict in Israel and Gaza right now. And actually, Dan and I didn't plan it this way, but that song, This Is My Father's World, that third verse really touches on a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about together today. It said, "This is my Father's world. Oh, let me never forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. This is my Father's world. Why should my heart be sad? The Lord is King. Let heaven ring. God reigns. Let earth be glad." What appropriate words, aren't they? Now, I want to be very clear in a lesson like this. I am no expert on geopolitics. I am not a strategist when it comes to foreign policy. I know as much as anybody else does in that conflict based on the reporting that I have access to in our media in the United States of America. So let's be crystal clear, in a setting like this, where our goal is to preach the gospel and talk about God and talk about Jesus and glorify Him, this is absolutely not the setting to tell you how to vote. This is not the setting for us to devise some kind of foreign policy or some strategy for Israel. And this isn't even necessarily a place where I'm going to tell you whether you have to support Israel or you can be sympathetic to Palestine or anything like that. This is a lesson about what are Christians supposed to think of this current conflict. And I'll tell you the reason why this lesson exists, why the genesis for this lesson is, ever since this war broke out a couple weeks ago, as a preacher, I have been fielding question after question after question from multiple different people, members of our own congregation, and in Bible studies that I do out in the community. In fact, there's several Bible studies that I do on a weekly basis with different groups around Collierville, and it's kind of the weirdest thing that when stuff happens in the news, surprise, surprise, preachers get asked about it. Preachers get asked about it. What am I supposed to think about this war going on in Israel right now? Specifically, are we supposed to support Israel, or can we be sympathetic to Palestine? Is this thing happening in Israel? Is it the sign of things to come? Are we supposed to be reading the tea leaves in the news right now to figure out, is Jesus coming back? Maybe Jesus is coming back. I think I read something in Ezekiel one time. Isn't there something in Revelation somewhere near the back that when Israel gets into a war with like Russia or something like that Jesus is going to come back? It's questions like that I've been fielding, it seems like on a very regular basis the last couple weeks, that I just thought, well, let's just put a lesson together. Let's just talk about some of these things. And as I was sitting there before I got up to preach, the other thought that I had was, have you ever ordered a steak and then it comes to you and you go, egads, how am I going to finish this thing? So we have half an hour and I'm going to touch on geopolitics and premillennialism, and we're going to answer all your questions. So let's just jump into it. First things first, the existence of war itself, whether it's the war in Ukraine or Israel and Hamas or any other war for that matter. Let's be clear about something. War is not a new problem, especially in a very problematic place like the Middle East. In fact, Jesus acknowledges in Matthew chapter 24 that war is going to be a kind of a surprisingly commonplace thing. He observes in Matthew chapter 24, specifically in verses 4 through 13, that you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. There's going to be famines and earthquakes. And he said, really, this is just the beginning of birth pangs. This is, in a sense, he's saying, don't be shocked by that. Don't be surprised by that. When you hear about war and rumors of wars, in a way, that's just kind of the world operating normally. That's just how the world is. That there are going to be conflicts and people are going to die in these conflicts, and that is not a new thing, and it should not be something that shocks us. After all, kingdoms and empires rise and fall, and that should never rock our faith. Now, I want to be clear, I am not a strict pacifist, and I just want to be upfront with you. Let's lay out all our cards. I'm not a strict pacifist. I know a lot of Christians who are, and I know a lot of Christians who are really actually adamantly against pacifism in its strictest sense of the term. So I don't think that I'm saying this to be like a fence rider or anything, but I just really believe that when you take the New Testament as a whole and what the overall teaching of the New Testament is, I do think that there is a kind of a form of pacifism that seems to be the consistent teaching of the New Testament. The turning your cheek when someone slaps you on the other cheek, the learning to serve other people first and loving your neighbor as yourself, the respecting authority and governments and earthly authorities. I do think that there is you may call it a kind of pacifism, though I don't think that the New Testament teaches strict pacifism the way that some people may think of it in a historical sense. But with that being said, I do think that the New Testament teaches us that we respect earthly powers. We respect our government. We dutifully pay our taxes, and we respect those who are in authority. We pray for our earthly leaders. That's a responsibility that we have. I might not get to decide for the president what he's going to do, and I might not get to decide for Congress if Congress is going to go ahead and vote on going to war with another nation. That's not necessarily my decision of whether we go to war or don't go to war, but what I can do is I can pray for them. I can pray for them. And that's a lot more powerful than we sometimes think that it is. Like we think of prayer as being like, well, you know, when you can't do anything else, I guess pray. No, hey, first pray before you do anything else. Not when you can't do anything else. No, before you do anything else, pray. And so I think Paul is very clear in 1 Timothy chapter 2 that you pray for those who are in authority. And Peter is very clear in 1 Peter chapter 2 that you submit to your leaders and be respectful. And our goal is to lead a tranquil and quiet life and to preach the gospel. Like that's what I care about, is preaching the gospel to people. And I am less concerned with politics than I am preaching the gospel. We're supposed to practice self-sacrifice and not to be self-interested people. I think that's a very important thing, that we sacrifice for others. There is no greater love that someone can show than to lay down his life for his friends. That's what Jesus said in John chapter 15. That is a Christian attitude. We trust God with justice, ultimately. We leave it up to God. When the martyrs at the altar in Revelation 6 are saying, "How long, O Lord? What's taken you so long?" They are reassured and they are comforted, and we all need to be reminded, vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So don't take your own personal revenge. God has got justice covered. We seek peace and reconciliation with our enemies. That is absolutely a core Christian principle, to seek peace and reconciliation, to pray for our enemies. And he says in Matthew chapter 5, love your enemies. You've heard it was said, hate your enemies. No. Love your enemies. Pray for them. And you might just be able to turn your enemies into your brothers and sisters if you present the gospel to them as well. Those are Christian principles. And before we say anything else about war and politics and whatever, let's just make sure that we're being Christians in our attitude and our approach to things that we see in the news. We are Christians first and foremost, American citizens second. And so let's try to remember that. But why is there so much interest in Israel right now? Like, what is the big deal? Who cares about some conflict in a part of the world that's on the other side of this globe that really has very little impact on me? Now, I'm not going to get into all the history of it because there's way too much of it, but let me define a few things for you and just give you some background about why does it seem like some people, especially in America, why are some people so obsessed with Israel? It's actually a relatively small country. Like if you think about it in terms of its geological or geographic size, it's kind of a small country out there. It's sort of a small fish in a big pond. Why do we care so much about Israel? Now, a lot of it goes back to the concept of Zionism. Zionism, as it's properly defined, started near the end of the 19th century, and it was this theory that Jews around the world have a right to go back to their original homeland in Palestine, and that the world ought to rally together to help create a country for them, and that it is the world's responsibility to then foster and keep safe this country, and that if Israel is not reestablished, then Jesus is not ever going to come back and reign for his 1,000-year millennial reign. And so you can see then why so many people around the world became very interested in Israel as this kind of hot topic in the early 20th century. Like, well, you know, if Israel's not there, where is Jesus going to reign? Because we believe, some people do, I'm not saying we do, I mean generalizing, we believe that, hey, if Jesus doesn't have a throne to sit on in Jerusalem, then there's nowhere for him to reign. So we need to make a new Israel and reestablish Jerusalem as this religious capital and so that when Jesus comes back for his millennial reign, we'll have his seat already and a cushion on the throne, all prepared. See, Jesus, we made Israel for you. Now you can reign. And so after World War II in 1948, it was agreed by the rest of the world, not by some people in the world, but it was agreed by the rest of the world that we'll go ahead and make a country Israel. And so Israel was established in 1948 as an autonomous country with the eager expectation and anticipation that now we've done everything that we can to sort of lay the framework for the millennial reign of Jesus. Now, this whole notion was pushed by authors like Hal Lindsey, who wrote a very, very popular and has since been completely debunked book called The Late Great Planet Earth, and by a number of other televangelists and ultra-conservative leaders. Jerry Falwell, for example. Pat Robinson was another one of the 700 Club. And these guys pushed this idea of Zionism, that it's our responsibility as Christians to preserve Israel or else Jesus isn't going to come back. Now again, premillennialism is a false doctrine. The Bible does not actually promise that Jesus is going to have a 1,000-year literal reign here on earth. That's drawn from a single reference in the book of Revelation that is purely symbolic and understood in its symbolism, understood in its context in Revelation. Nobody would ever come to the conclusion, if you understood the symbolism, that Jesus was literally going to reign here on planet Earth for 1,000 years. And so the notion is debunked. And again, some of the historical references and ideas and prophecies are also debunked. And I put a couple of references up on the screen that we don't have time to look at in exact detail, but Zechariah 13, Ezekiel 39 is actually a really interesting one that is a whole study on its own. But there's a belief that Ezekiel 39, the whole chapter, is really a prophecy about the restoration of Israel as an autonomous nation here on earth. But what are the problems with this? First and most obviously, interpretations of prophecies related to things in the news are frequently proven to be false. Just like it says in the book of Deuteronomy. Do you want to know who a false prophet is versus a real prophet? Well, just wait around long enough and you'll find out who the false prophets are. Just let their prophecies be proven false by reality and facts and history. Time and time again, the signs of the times are nothing more than getting caught up in the moment. And to those who witness war firsthand, every war feels like it must be the Battle of Armageddon. The Bible, however, consistently teaches that Israel, the physical nation of Israel, is not the same thing as Israel, the spiritual kingdom of Israel. And I use those terms on purpose because they get conflated. As if geographic, political, literal, physical Israel is the same thing as God's kingdom that is frequently called Israel symbolically in the Bible. Even at the worst of times in the Old Testament, spiritually, God had a remnant of faithful followers. Even when God rejected Israel, the nation, he never rejected Israel, the spiritual kingdom. Because there's always been Israel, the spiritual kingdom. And Paul points that out in the New Testament in Romans chapter 11. He says, at this time, there has come to be that remnant. The same remnant that God talked about back in 1 Kings, where he was reassuring the prophet Elijah that 7,000 have not bowed the knee to Baal. He's saying, that remnant is still here. And that remnant is always here. There is always a faithful remnant of God's people. There is always a spiritual kingdom that exists outside the bounds of earthly politics and geography and borders. And that spiritual Israel is God's true kingdom. And it has nothing to do with ethnicity or earthly citizenship. The concept, furthermore, is driven home when you look at words like Jew or Israelite or circumcised in the New Testament. New Testament writers frequently talk about how when you define a Jew or an Israel or circumcision, make sure that you're spiritualizing those concepts. Let me give you a few examples. In Romans chapter 2, Paul talks about one who is a Jew outwardly, who is circumcised physically, is not the same thing as one who is a Jew inwardly, who has been circumcised in his heart. What does God care about? Ethnicity and circumcision, or in the heart in spiritual circumcision? Well, he goes on later on in chapter 9 of Romans and talks in the same way. He says that they are not all Israel who are descendants of Israel. They're not all Israel who are physically descendants of Israel. Essentially, he's saying what constitutes Israel as God's kingdom is not the same thing as what constitutes Israel, the physical descendants of Abraham. Now, if it was a Venn diagram, is there some overlap there? Are there physical descendants of Israel who are also spiritual Israel? Of course there are. Paul himself would talk about that. An Israelite of Israelites, a Benjamite. But one does not presuppose the other if you have not given your life over to Jesus Christ. And the other interesting thing is the concept of Zion, right? Zionism, we've got to reestablish Israel. Jesus is going to come back in judgment. The concept of Zion already existed back in the first century. Zion didn't start existing in 1948. You could be in Zion when the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 through 24, that we have not come to Mount Sinai, a big scary mountain with thunder and lightning. No, we have come to Mount Zion. You could already be in Mount Zion back in the first century. And so the existence of political Israel is not connected to the existence of Zion here in the world. All right, well, wait a minute, Ryan. Wait a minute. So are you, either you're saying that what Hamas is doing is okay and there's nothing wrong with it, or you're just saying we're just supposed to be indifferent about the whole thing, right? Well, let me be clear about another thing. Evil is still evil. When you take away the Zionist, millennialist element of this whole conversation, right? Debunk the whole notion of God coming back and Jesus reigning for 1,000 years in Jerusalem on a literal throne. Even if you take that away and you throw that in the trash bin, you are still left with real injustices, and you are still left with a real moral issue when it comes to any conflict, whether it's Israel and Hamas or any other war in any other part of the world in all of human history. War still leaves you with serious moral issues. For generations, going all the way back to Isaac and Ishmael, actually, in the book of Genesis, there's always been conflict in that part of the world. A cascade of death and destruction. And the solution has always been found in just following the teaching of the Lord. In Romans chapter 12, for example, we've already sort of referenced it a little bit here, but in Romans chapter 12 and verse 17 through the end of the chapter, the writer, Paul, makes it very clear, never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Insofar as it depends on you, be at peace with all people. Never take your own revenge, beloved. Leave room for the wrath of God. And some people might call it an oversimplification, but I think some of the greatest truths are truly very simple truths. If people treated each other like this, we would not have to worry so much about war. Because that's what it is. This is just purely Ryan's commentary as someone who is not personally living in the Middle East. And so I understand that I come at this from a distance, and I'm not unsympathetic to that fact that I'm living in a safe place where I'm not being bombed. I'm not unsympathetic to that. But when you look at the history of the Middle East, it's basically just a escalation. You know, hey, you killed one of our people, so we're going to kill two of your people. Oh, yeah? Well, we're going to bomb your marketplace. Oh, yeah? Well, we're going to bomb a school bus full of children. Oh, yeah? We're going to knock a whole building down. Oh, yeah? Do you know what prevents that? Never pay back evil for evil to anyone and leave room for the wrath of God. Stop taking your own revenge. You know why God tells us to not take our own revenge? Because we're horrible at it. We are terrible at taking vengeance. We're awful. We're awful at it. Now, how is it any different? What Hamas is doing to Israel right now, they're fighting a holy war to regain their territory. How is that any different than what God told the Israelites to do to the land of Canaan? Because, I don't know, it kind of gets a little uncomfortable there, doesn't it? I mean, God tells you to fight a holy war so that you can go get your land back. Aren't we basically just reading the book of Joshua there? Well, let me give you some observations. And I do think it's a great question. It's a very difficult question. And if it was okay, as someone might argue, for God to send Israel into holy wars against the Canaanites or to go kill the Amalekites, every man, woman, and child, then who are we to judge Muslim jihadists for essentially making the same argument? First of all, I don't think they're analogous situations. They're not analogous situations. The language, if you really track the language in the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua, the language that God uses of the Israelites going into Canaan is not annihilate every single person that you see. Like, that's not the language that's used. Rather, dozens of times, the language, and I left some references up there, but these are several among dozens and dozens of examples. The language is always dispossess or displace these people. The language is always, they know you're coming and they have the choice to get out of the way. Now, if they don't get out of the way, well, then there's a repercussion to that, and that's Jericho and Ai and the others, but they know you're coming. It's interesting, isn't it, that when you look at Rahab the harlot in the book of Judges chapter 2, did everybody in Jericho know exactly what was going to happen? Well, maybe they didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but did anybody see the Israelites off on the horizon going like, well, who are they? Yeah, who are those folks? I see dust on the horizon and like 1.5 million people. Who are they? No, Rahab says, we all know what's been going on for 40 years. We knew what happened at the Red Sea. We knew what happened to those two kings of Bashan, Sihon, and Og, whatever their names were. Like, we know exactly who you are and exactly what you're trying to do. Everybody in Jericho had an opportunity to live. And Rahab's life is evidence of that. Furthermore, God instructed them to offer peace terms. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, it says, when you go to war with someone, you're to offer them peace terms beforehand. So the comparison between the conquest of Canaan and terrorist jihad in the Middle East, I don't think that you can make that comparison. Not only that, but the scope was actually really, really quite small. God established Israel within borders. He says, you're going to take from this place to this place, and that's it. And you're going to stop, and you're going to be done. And those are your borders. That is not the same thing as what jihadists want to do. And so I did a little bit of research, and please don't go down this rabbit trail. This is a dark place to go. But I went online, and I actually read the Charter of Hamas, which is of course, the ruling organization in Gaza. And on Hamas's own charter, this was their agreed upon charter, the Hamas regards itself the spearhead and the vanguard of the circle of struggle against world Zionism. Islamic groups all over the Arab world should also do the same, since they are best equipped for their future role in the fight against the warmongering Jews. I think there's a huge difference between Israel, I have promised you a land, and here is how I want you to go about possessing that land and displacing the people there. There's a huge difference between that and my goal in life is to see the annihilation of all Jews in the entire world. I just don't think that those are analogous situations, so that the argument breaks down. Now, look at this. We're actually doing really well on time because I'm at our last point. And this is probably the most important one, because this is the what am I supposed to do? All right, we've talked all about this. We've skirted around politics and war and premillennialism and all that. And that's all fine in theory, and you've thrown a lot of information at me, Ryan, but at the end of the day, you still haven't answered the question, what am I supposed to think of Israel and Hamas right now? My first bit of advice is, don't fall for the sensationalism and false doctrine like the Zionists and the millennialists do. Jesus, and let me be very clear, Jesus is no more or less likely to come in judgment because of anything that is happening in the world right now. Jesus will come back in judgment when it is the Father's will to do so. And that may happen tonight, or 5 minutes from now, or 5,000 years from now. Jesus made a statement in Matthew chapter 24 that of that hour and day, only the Father knows. Not even the Son knows. Only the Father knows. And when God decides that it's time for the judgment day to happen, you know that his army of angels is ready, and you know that Jesus is prepared. The question is not, are Jesus and the angels ready for the day of judgment? The question is, am I? Our job is not to read tea leaves in the news and go, a war in the Middle East, maybe, could mean this. It's the signs of the times. No, our job is to be ready right now. And to be prepared right now, like 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 11 says, your job is to be sober-minded. Be sober-minded and be ready. Because God has not destined us for wrath. God has destined us for life eternal. If you're ready for it. Be careful. Here's the other piece of advice. This is a tough one too. Be careful not to turn people into caricatures. We see people in the news, AK-47 wielding jihadists. And then we've got our Muslim coworker in the cubicle next to us, or our Muslim neighbor in the house next over. I think it's really inappropriate for us to make caricatures out of people and to assume the worst about people around us. Peter made a good observation in 1 Peter chapter 2, which again we've already cited earlier in the lesson, but he says we need to keep our behavior excellent among the Gentiles. And he says to honor all men. Part of keeping your behavior excellent and honoring all men is to assess individuals as individuals. It's a fact. It is a fact that there are crazy, brainwashed Muslim jihadists somewhere in the world shooting AK-47s off into the air. Your neighbor or coworker is not one of them. And so we have to show that kind of love. Otherwise, our witness for Christ is worthless. And finally, there are compelling political reasons. If you are so inclined to support Israel from a political perspective, I do think that there are compelling political reasons to do so. There's something to be said of a stable democracy in a typically unstable part of the world and a longtime regional partner. I think that no state, no country, no nation is or ever has been perfect, but try not to get caught up in the way that certain things are presented in the news. Media always has a bias to it, and I think we just need to be really careful to sort of take everything that we see with a grain of salt in the news. We need to keep our focus on the mission. And whatever's happening in Israel doesn't change the mission. Whatever's happening in Ukraine doesn't change the mission. Whatever's happening in a crime-ridden part of our own city or our own community doesn't change the mission. The mission has always been the same: to go into all the world and preach the gospel, to make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. That mission has always been the same. And while there are wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes and famines that happen all around us, Jesus encourages his followers in Matthew chapter 24 to not lose heart, because it is the faithful, it is the spiritually resilient who will make it to the end. Now, if you're not a Christian here this morning, you really ought to be. You have a choice to make, a decision that needs to be made. To be on the side of Jesus, the rider on the white horse from Revelation 19. To be clothed in fine white linen, to ride on a white horse of your own. To be victorious in him and in him alone. Or to pick the side that has already lost. So whatever spiritual need you might have, please let that need be known by coming forward as we stand and sing together.
Jesus.